Have you ever wondered what would have happened if you made different choices throughout your life? Zigged when you should have zagged. On average, we make around 35,000 choices each and every day, from the moment we wake up in the morning to the moment we close our eyes and fall asleep at night. The choices we make in any given moment determines how each and every subsequent moment unfolds, which then presents us with another set of choices, and the process starts all over again. There's growing scientific evidence that suggests that the choices we make do have lasting consequences. Conversely, each option we didn't choose in any given moment actually plays out in its own parallel universe. A universe where we went right instead of left, where we like pineapple on our pizza. Every possible choice that can be made is created and branches off to spawn an infinite number of parallel universes, each resulting in different outcomes. In this week's episode of Science vs. Conspiracy, we will be discussing parallel universes over coffee, or in some parallel universe, over tea. Welcome back, I'm Conspiracy.
And I'm Science.
And we're the hosts of Science vs. Conspiracy over coffee. Today we'll be doing a deep dive into the concept of parallel universes. Do they exist, or are they stuff of science fiction?
Or is it both?
When we come back, we'll do a deep dive into the origins of parallel universes. And we'll discuss a few stories of people who claim to have visited actual parallel universes. All that and more still to come. Over the years, there have been countless science fiction, fantasy books, movies, TV shows, and comic books dedicated to the idea of a multiverse. The idea of multiple universes or parallel universes have been gaining in popularity over the last number of years, most recently with Disney's cinematic release of the new Spider-Man No Way Home. The movie takes place, in part, in a parallel universe. However, the idea of parallel universes isn't a new concept. It actually dates back a millennia. Some of the earliest known records of the idea of parallel universes occurred in ancient Greece. It's during this time that we find two schools of thought, the atomists and the Stoics. In the 5th century BCE, the first group, the atomists, argued our world was the accidental product of colliding atoms in an infinite void. These collisions gave rise to an endless number of parallel universes, each less perfect than our own. Unlike the atomists, the Stoics described the universe recycling itself. During the 3rd century BCE, Stoic philosopher Chrysippus of Soli imagined that the world would eventually deteriorate into a sort of ethereal nothingness, only to pull a Doctor Who and regenerate again. However, unlike Doctor Who, who is limited to a finite number of regenerations, the universe would repeat the cycle indefinitely. It wasn't until the Middle Ages, in the 15th century, that Giordano Bruno broke with the Catholic Church geocentric view and wrote that the universe had no center and no circumference. He also postulated that the number of possible worlds in existence throughout the universe was infinite. It wasn't just in Europe that the idea was beginning to grow. Ancient Buddhists said our world is one of many, which undergoes an infinite cycle of creation and destruction. When we come back, a man flies from a parallel universe, and the legend of Woolpit. Unfortunately, we haven't had the opportunity to travel much these past couple of years because of all the travel restrictions due to the pandemic. However, back in 1954, people were traveling quite freely. So free, in fact, that one business traveler took a flight to Japan from another universe. When the man arrived at the Japanese airport, he was met by the customs agents. He was unable to provide a proper country of origin to the agents. The country that was listed on the man's passport was Taurid. Now, you're probably just as confused as the customs agents were back in 1954. because where in the world is Taurid? Despite the man having a very convincing looking passport, Taurid isn't a country on Earth. At least not on our Earth. Despite being interrogated by customs, the man insisted he was from Taurid. His passport was even stamped properly from all his travels. He said he had even flown through Japan a number of times on various business trips. When the man was asked to point out Taurid on the map, he couldn't find it. The man seemed to be just as confused as the customs agents. Unable to figure out what was happening, the man was taken to a nearby hotel until they could solve the mystery. Things got a little weirder at the hotel. There were police officers standing guard outside the hotel room to make sure that the man didn't leave. Then, when the guards went into the hotel room to check on the man in the morning, he had vanished, gone without a trace. So, what'd you think of that story?
It's interesting, for sure.
What's your take on it?
My take is true and false.
Okay, explain.
Okay, I have an open mind about things, you know. What is true? A man was certainly arrested in Japan in 1959 for using a false passport that he created. That was supposedly issued by a non-existent country. So that's where we get into the falsification parts of this. Essentially, it was fraud, and more fraud.
Yes, however, the time doesn't match up. 1954, when this report comes in, and compared to the one you just talked about, 1959, so there's a few years difference there.
There's no 1954. It was all fraud. It was all fraud.
But the story started circulating in 1954.
No, that's impossible. And he did not hail from another dimension. He was trying to travel the world freely, and created his own passport. He was prosecuted and sentenced by the Japanese authorities, and he didn't mysteriously vanish from a guarded hotel room. He was taken to jail, and his wife was deported.
Well, that's all great, but it's the time frame doesn't match up, though. It's 1954 compared to 1959.
Okay, so people make mistakes in typing and transcribing. So where did you read this article? Online, right?
I've read multiple.
But if people don't do their background research or background work, then it could be a typo, just like the fact that he is called the man from Taurid. And that's actually a typo on the Tuareg group that he is actually probably part of from the country around in Algeria. And that's probably where he came from. So Tamanrasset that he listed is actually the name of a province and city in Algeria. And the Tuareg is the name of a group of people around there. So, I mean, he, his story was false, and probably some of the data and reports are false too, and people make mistakes. Just like all the all the passport checkers, all the security checkers letting him through with that passport. Obviously, they weren't paying attention. Human error.
But he said he couldn't pinpoint the name, or he couldn't locate his country on the map. And everything looked different.
Because he was spewing lies, Bob. He was spewing lies. He pointed to Andorra.
But why?
Because he was trying to put forth a falsification.
But there's being fraudulent and then coming across as a crazy person from another dimension. Those are two different things.
Oh, yeah, I know. But, I mean, what better story than, just I'm in the country illegally. No, I'm from another dimension.
Yeah, I'm going to get locked up if I say I'm from another dimension.
Well, he was going to get locked up anyway. At this point, he was actually hoping, I'm assuming, of course, that, if he was welcomed as someone from another dimension, then he would be given free reign and hospitality and welcomes and, because that's like a revered thing almost.
I don't know.
Yeah.
I still don't think the timelines match up. That's my biggest issue with this.
And more fraud. The only thing that was factual was that he had indeed traveled extensively.
Agree to disagree.
And that's what we're going to do a lot of on this podcast, and that's okay, folks. Because, hey, we respect each other, and that's what matters. And, you know, a little bit of preachiness here, because there's a lot of crap going on in the world right now. And you can respectfully disagree. You don't have to believe what other people believe, and your beliefs don't have to impinge upon somebody else's beliefs. Just don't be a jerk face about it. All right, moving on.
Moving on. Our next story dates back to the 12th century in a small little village called Woolpit. Now, Woolpit was and still is a small village situated in the English countryside, midway between the towns of Bury St. Edmunds and Stow Market. It was here in the 12th century where the legend of the Green Children of Woolpit began. Legend has it that one afternoon during harvest, a young girl and her brother were found wandering around the outskirts of the village. They were there by the wolf pits, which gave the town its name. They didn't speak any English, and in fact, nobody from the village could understand them. The children spoke in a most curious way. The villagers had never heard anything like it before or since. They appeared to be normal children, except of course for the weird language, the unfamiliar clothes, and of course the green skin. The children stayed in Woolpit and eventually learned to speak English. Sadly, shortly after they were baptized, the boy became sick and passed away. After learning to speak English, the girl explained that her and her brother had come from a place they called St. Martin's Land, a subterranean world inhabited by green people, a place where the sun never shone and the light was like twilight, and their only source of food was broad beans. The children were unable to account for their arrival in Woolpit. They said that they had been herding their father's cattle when they heard a loud noise, perhaps a bell, and then suddenly found themselves by the wolf pits. The children were unable to account for their arrival in Woolpit. They had been herding their father's cattle when they heard a loud noise, and suddenly they were transported to where they were found next to the wolf pit. Okay, now tell me that that's not a legit story.
Well, kind of like the man from Towered, I think some of this might be true and much of it false. And let me tell you why.
Okay, let's hear this. This should be good.
So, you know, there's this thing called hypochromic anemia. Hypochromic anemia.
Explain.
So it's hypochromic anemia, which, you know, has been also known as chlorosis or the green sickness. And essentially what it means is that there's a disproportionate reduction of hemoglobin, right, carried by your red blood cells, in proportion to the volume of your cell. And so, you know, these people who may have anything from low iron intake to a diminished iron absorption to excessive iron losses for some reason, and I can go into a whole list of reasons why this might be happening, and we can get there in a second. But essentially what happens is you look more and more pale until you take on a greenish tint. Now, that's part one. There's another reason why the green tint could have been happening.
Okay.
They came from the caves.
They came from a parallel universe. That's why they're green.
Right? They came from the caves. What if there was a high copper content in the caves? We all know what happens when you put on cheap jewelry. And if you don't know, go buy a cheap fake gold bracelet, wear it for a week, especially in the shower. Eventually your skin's going to turn green. So these two things combined could have given the children their greenish tint. Now, what could have happened to them to give them this low iron reduction. What did they claim that they ate?
They claimed they ate beans.
What kind of beans? Okay, broad beans. Would you believe that there is actually a disease called favism? Hence, like fava beans, favism. Fava beans is another word for these broad beans, okay? And what happens to people who have this, which is based on a metabolic error, inborn metabolic error, it causes their blood cells to lysis. And lysis means they break. So your blood cells break and you lose that red blood cell content. So essentially, it's inducing this anemia that I talked about before. So if these kids lived in a cave, and they ate nothing but broad beans raw, then they could have developed favism and went through this period of hemolytic lysis, because it is noted that upon eating better, the green tinge went away.
Because they've been in our universe for a longer period of time.
What's more logical, Bob? Ever heard of Occam's razor?
Yeah, parallel universes. How do you explain the language?
Okay.
Language difference. Nobody had ever heard of, the people in the village in Woolpit had never heard of the village that they were talking about. When the children went back to where they said that they came from, that pathway wasn't there anymore. They had never heard of the language, the city, like the village that these little kids came from.
Okay.
How do you explain that?
I can explain that. Again, most logically, these kids were probably abducted. They were probably prisoners being held in that cave.
But they never said anything about being held prisoner.
Yeah, I know, because they were too sick and probably terrified and probably in some sort of dissociative fugue from having been abducted and going through all this. And then these caves and these water pathways that they supposedly came through was probably their means of escape. So these kids were traumatized. They were held captive or lived in a cave to escape. Either they were held captive in the cave or went through the caves to escape. There was probably copper in there. They ate the broad beans that were raw to survive. And by the way, people who eat fava beans now, don't worry. It's actually been bred out of the beans. Back then, if they'd boiled it for 10 minutes, it would have rectified the favism that develops the lysis. But, they were eating them raw. And yeah, so, and about the language, one scientific inquiry into this that I read suggested that, you know what, they probably escaped from a different part of London with such a thick Cockney accent or something that nobody had even heard before.
That's a bit of fry chuck. I found a Lady Godiva on the frog.
Sometimes I don't understand what Jackie Tyler's saying when we watch Doctor Who. So, another option is that without proper parental socialization, the kids might have developed their own language amongst the two of them. And maybe this has also been witnessed in captive states as well, where they develop their own language to converse between the two of them so that their captors don't know what they're talking about.
But they still haven't, there's no reports and no indication that they were abducted or held captive anywhere.
This was like what, the 15th century?
12th century.
Yeah. Were there reports? Were there police reports that were well circulated at the time, Bob? Was there an internet?
No, but
children went missing all the time.
The reports in the internet and reports, that kind of thing, that comes into another time travel podcast that we'll get into later about the 12th century. But it was a small village. Nobody made any notes of it, of these children talking about being held captive. Like, that's the reports that I'm talking about. Not that I don't.
Okay.
There was no Scotland Yard at the time.
Fair enough, but one kid died soon after, right? And then the other one, it took her some time to even get proper language. Which I know is you're going to say is because she didn't speak English because she was from another planet or another universe.
Another planet is something different.
That's totally different. Yeah, they weren't aliens. They weren't from another universe. They were just poor kids who were probably abused, dissociative. She probably blocked it all out at this point, and wanted to not even talk about it later, and didn't have the language for what it meant to be held captive,
It's possible, but
it's possible.
But still, parallel universe.
Okay, so again, Occam's razor. I'm going to say that a lot during the podcast because what is the most logical explanation here? That they had an illness and were malnourished and had probably been kidnapped.
Probably.
Or from a parallel universe. What's more logical?
Parallel universe.
This is fun.
All right. Moving on.
Moving on to more current day.
Current day.
Right?
Just ahead, have NASA scientists actually detected a parallel universe mixing with our own? Let's find out. In the spring of 2020, a NASA-funded research team in Antarctica teased the world with the possibility of an anti-universe, where, from our point of view, time runs backwards, and the Big Bang represents the end and not the beginning. The scientists used a giant balloon to carry NASA's Antarctic Impulsive Transient Antenna, or ANITA for short, high above Antarctica, where the frigid, dry air provided the perfect environment with little to no radio noise to distort their findings. A constant wind of high-energy particles constantly arrives on the Earth from outer space. Low-energy subatomic neutrinos with a mass close to zero can pass completely through the Earth, but higher-energy objects are stopped by the solid matter of our planet. That means high-energy particles can only be detected coming down from space. But the team detected heavier particles which were coming up out of the Earth. The findings implies that these particles are actually traveling backwards in time, suggesting the evidence of a parallel universe. So there you go. There's some scientific science. Some scientific science there. Up in Antarctica.
There's definitely some science there. But does it mean they found evidence to prove the existence of a parallel universe? No.
They found it may not be direct evidence of a parallel universe, but there's definitely something weird going on with the neutrinos.
Yeah, but what they found was more likely that it doesn't jive with our current understanding of particle physics and how neutrinos interact with ice. And so, it may not mean that there's another universe. What it more likely means is that we just have an imperfect understanding of how neutrinos act, because it's still pretty a new discovery. I mean, relatively speaking, in the history of the universe, it's a new discovery. And
it's new because it's from parallel universe.
But there's no, that's like that's totally leaping to conclusions. Okay, so what this guy said, okay, so let's just back up with a little bit more science for people who don't know the whole story. Okay, so it's at this ANITA thing in the Antarctica, and ANITA stands for the Antarctic Impulsive Transient Antenna Study, okay? And what they found was upward pointing cosmic rays. But did they actually find upward pointing cosmic rays? The way that this one guy phrased it was that the only way it could happen is if the particle changed into a different type of particle before passing through the Earth and back again, as if it had passed through the Earth through a parallel universe. Right? Is that your understanding?
Yes, a mirror universe.
A mirror universe. Talk about leaping to conclusions. The only real conclusion here is that our current standard scientific model needs to be examined and investigated more. This was previously unwitnessed neutrino behavior. It just means that there's more science to be discovered, which is the whole point of science. This is the whole point of what they were doing, is discovery. But it doesn't mean there's evidence for another universe. What's more likely?
Parallel universe.
So, okay, allow me to present an analogy.
Okay.
We're going through a global pandemic that everybody's really sick of. But this coronavirus acts different than the one that gave us SARS back in like 2003 or whatever. Does that mean that this coronavirus is from a parallel universe? No.
I don't know what the Chinese are doing. Chinese scientists.
It's just a new discovery. And moreover, if it really were something massively anomalous with our universe and giving off these high energy cosmic rays at the rate that it said it was, the ice cube neutrino detector also at the South Pole would have picked it up, but it didn't. And that one is even more powerful. So for every one anomaly that would have been picked up by the ANITA study, the ice cube would have picked up way more, like a myriad more. So, like, really, what's more likely? Our imperfect understanding, or the most likely answer actually is human error. Just like we started off with the man from Taurid. Like, it's more likely human error. They either got too excited, misinterpreted, right? Because as we know, unfortunately, there's a lot of crappy scientists out there who don't fully understand data and statistics. So, perhaps maybe they misinterpreted the data, or it was just an honest accident in interpreting the data. Maybe they were seeing what they wanted to see, because that happens too. Data gets fudged all the time. And there's also actual measurement error. Like, it could have been something technical with the device measuring the rays, not realizing it was what they call the tau proteins, tau particles, that was more likely bouncing around.
Or, I'll give you an example. What if, in the not-so-distant future, there was a transporter accident which sent the captain to a mirror universe where up is down, down is up. Everybody's wearing goatees.
I know it happened. I saw it happen. Don't tell me it didn't happen.
No, but I can agree with you on a certain level with our lack of understanding of these particles, but it still doesn't necessarily rule out the possibility of interaction with a parallel universe.
It doesn't, and that's the thing. Like, of course, I can't say definitively what it was either. I wasn't there. I didn't do the science. I didn't do the analysis. and I'm far from being a physicist. I just know how to read research studies. I'm definitely a trained scientist, but not that kind. So, I can't say for sure it didn't happen. I can't say for sure there's no parallel universe. In fact, a lot of me wants to believe there is. A large part of me does believe that there is.
Mm-hmm.
I just don't think this is evidence of it. Not yet, anyway. We would need way more data, not one anomaly. Right. So let's wait.
Let's wait.
Let's call it,
This one's a draw.
This one's a draw, right? Like, it's not an agree to disagree on this one. It's like, I think we both need to wait for more data, honestly. Because I do believe there's parallel universes, multiverses. Like, we would be absolutely foolish to think that we're the only sentient beings out here. There's so many things that are beyond our understanding. We just don't have hard and solid evidence for it yet.
So that's about it for this week's episode.
Yeah, so what do you folks think? Drop us some comments, hit us up on social. We're on all the channels. This will be up on our YouTube channel in a few days. So definitely let us know. What do you think? Do you think that these are more likely parallel universe examples? Do you think that there's a possibility? Do you think it's just Occam's razor and human error for the most part? Let us know what you think.
Parallel universes.
Oh, and tell us also if there are any other examples that may speak to parallel universes that you want us to kind of dissect in the way that we did today. Conspiracy guy can talk about the conspiracy side of it, and science girl can talk about the science side of it. So let us know if there's any more that you want us to dissect.
Or if you or yourself have experienced being transported to a parallel universe, let us know. We want to hear your story.
Please do.
If you like the episode, don't forget to subscribe. You can download us on any of the major podcasting platforms. This week's episode of Science vs. Conspiracy Over Coffee was produced by Lethologica. Writing and research was done by Bob Homer and Jennifer Timer. See you next week, and remember, being paranoid is smart.